Yeah, my printable Blu-ray disc.
Yay.
Do we have a printer up there for that?
We do, but I have one.
Oh, you're special.
No, I need them. I saw Joe yesterday.
Joe Balla?
Yeah, Bob.
What?
Game. I have the game.
What game?
Jazz game.
Oh, you went to the Jazz game? Oh, he got a good rejection last night.
Yeah. Yeah, it was actually pretty good. They let them in the whole, last quarter. Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah.
Did you make shots of him?
No.
David, we need
Well, I saw a guy with a glide cam down there. I was
So
like,
you needed to grab your iPhone.
right? Did I get shots of him?
Live? This is live, but I thought there was a separate button. It was supposed to. So maybe we can kind of clean up all our cables back here.
Now I want
So Keela, we just need to show how to use the camera and how to connect everything like this.
Okay.
And then,
So I just tell her to go down to your office and then I'll meet with her.
can she come over here right after this event? And you can just show her.
Okay, I'll email her right now. Or do you have her number?
I might have her on email.
I'll have her on email. So I'll just email her right now.
I guess we could. It would just be nice to show her how we connected it here.
Time's 11:30.
Here, I'll go talk in the mic too so you can get an audio check.
What bar room is this?
This one's A. Mic check. 1, 2, 3. 2, 3, 4, 5. Mic check.
Hold on, let me get my headphones.
Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mic check. 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay. I heard you for a little bit, but
Check this one. Check. Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
yep, gotcha. But I keep hearing this like a whatever is it back, whatever. I hear that like pretty good.
Yeah. Is the shotgun mic off?
I
Shotgun,
turned
so it's just on this.
I turned down the level. That's one. We're on. That's channel 1, so I hear you on it, but I still hear the that buzz sound. It's not very clean.
Oh, I can hear you really good. So I'm probably picking you up from this mic.
Oh yeah.
Uh-huh. So,
Oh yeah.
1, 2. So, are you look on the meter there? Are you seeing that? All right.
I thought this is channel 1.
So that's in 1.
Because I turned down channel 2, but I'm still seeing this.
So is it? So that's in 1. And we don't need phantom. Test 1 2 1 2 3 4 5. Mic check 1 2 3 4 5. Testing 1 2 3 4 5. Test 1 2 1 2 3 4 5. Test 1 2 3 4 5. Check 1 2 3 4 5. Testing 1 2 3 4 5. Test 1 2 1 2 3 4 5. Check 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2. So they might be sending a line signal. Check 1 2 1 2. Test 1 2 3 4 5. Okay. Test 1 2 3 4 5. Mic check 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. Testing 1 2 1 2 1 2. Is that level good? Test 1 2 3 4 5. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. Test 1 2 3 4 5. Mic check. You got it? Both channels? Test 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. We good? David's a good guy.
Check, check, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Check, check. Check, check. One, two, check.
Is it being all?
Check one. This whole room might just be too loud. You're coming out the output, right?
Yep.
Check. Check, check, check.
Can you do the changeover in 305? Needs to go to boardroom for 15, and all the extra tables need to come out. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Do you want to do presenter view?
Yeah. Oh, what is this? Oh, no. Well, it doesn't, no.
No?
I guess wherever it was. I don't know, it's like a new, it's a new thing. I've never seen it do that before.
Yeah, me either.
Um,
But I'll let you get started then.
how did I? Okay.
All right. Have fun then.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello and welcome, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Fantastic. Well, we're very happy that you joined us this morning for this event. My name is Stephanie McClure, and I'm the director of the Weber State University Women's Center and the Safe at Weber Violence Prevention and Advocacy Center here on campus. Safe at Weber is a comprehensive violence prevention advocacy services program which serves all WSU students, staff, and faculty. We work to address all forms of violence, as we know we won't see an end to domestic violence or sexual violence until we see also an end to sexism, racism, ableism, heterosexism, classism, and other forms of domination and oppression. We work very hard to provide prevention education and action opportunities to the WSU community that focuses on social justice, bystander intervention, healthy relationships, and consent. Additionally, we provide non-confidential advocacy services for students who want to report to the institution or law enforcement. Our advocate, Paige Davies. Paige, are you in the room right now? I think she may be outside. She provides survivor-centered support to students, aids in filing and navigating Title IX and law enforcement reports, and helps with accessing accommodations related to student academics. Thank you. There are a couple of things that I want to make sure you all hear from a Weber State administrator before leaving this room. The first is that sexual assault, relationship violence, and stalking are prohibited here at Weber State. And if you experience discrimination, sexual harassment, unwanted sexual contact, abuse by a partner, or stalking, we here at Safe at Weber believe you and are here to support you. The second is that every member of our community has the right to report these violations to the university through our office in the Women's Center, which is right down the hall here on the 3rd floor next to the testing center, to the Title IX Coordinator's Office, Barry Gomberg, the Director of Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity, or through our campus police department. Today, you all are going to hear an invitation to learn about you and your fellow students' rights to an education free from harassment and discrimination, an invitation to stand with and support survivors in our community, and an invitation to stand with Safe at Weber in upholding our university's values of access, learning, and engagement, and respect for all people, as well as nurturing the potential within every individual. I hope that you choose to join us in this effort. There are so many ways that each and every one of us in this room today can make a difference and help stop and prevent violence within our community. I, like you, am incredibly excited to hear Andrea's and Annie's message on this, but I also want to invite you all to come meet with the Safe at Weber crew. We're the ones in the purple Safe at Weber t-shirts after this, and get signed up to join us to prevent violence here at Weber State. We are incredibly grateful for your support, for showing up today and being here to discuss this important issue. We would also like to thank all of our campus and community partners for helping to make this day a reality. We would like to thank Student Involvement and Leadership, the Scholarship and Professional Growth Committee, the Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity Office and Title IX Coordinator, the Vice President of Student Affairs, the WSU Chief Diversity Officer, the Engaged Learning Series, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Psychology for their financial contributions. Additionally, we would like to thank Mike Vaughn, the Director of the Center for the Study of Poverty and Economic Inequality, for lighting the spark that led to today's event, Provost Madon Miner, Diversity and Inclusive Programming, Student Affairs Technology, Marketing and Communications, the Department of History, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, WSU Purchasing and Travel, Creative Academic Technology Solutions, the Police Department here on campus, Your Community Connection, YCC, and Safe Harbor for providing input and many hours of work to make today run smoothly. Lastly, we are incredibly grateful for the sponsorship we received for this event by University Broiler and Grill, our neighbor just down the road, who serves delicious Greek cuisine to many WSU members daily. Again, I thank you all for your attendance and participation today. During this next hour, we'll be discussing difficult subjects. We encourage everyone to practice self-care and feel free to step out to get a drink of water or use the restroom. We have both Paige, our non-confidential Safe at Weber advocate. Paige, can you raise your hand in the back? As well as confidential advocates from the YCC and Safe Harbor. Can you all stand so folks know where you're at as well in the back, in case anyone wants to access services today? If you're moved by what you hear today and you want to bring this conversation to larger circles through social media, we ask that folks use the hashtag #SafeAtWeber spelled out. Our social media guru, Lara, will be responding to comments and questions via Facebook, so feel free to connect with us throughout the event. Additionally, we ask that you be so kind as to fill out your pre-assessment forms before our speakers get on stage, and fill out the post-assessment form at the end of the program. Your feedback will be used to inform our efforts here at Safe at Weber and assess whether programming like today's is effective and meeting the needs of our community. Once filled out, you can leave both of these assessment forms on your chair and we will pick them up afterwards. With that, I would like to welcome Catherine Shackelford, our Safe at Weber Student Violence Prevention Coordinator, to the stage so that she can introduce our wonderful and courageous speakers from End Rape on Campus, Andrea Pino and Annie Clark. Thank you all.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. Today, we are joined by Andrea Pino and Annie Clark, who are here to speak to us about our survivor rights on college campuses, how we can support survivors, and what we can all do to prevent violence within our community. Annie E. Clark is a co-founder of End Rape on Campus and a lead complainant in the Title IX and Clery complaints against the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in political science. She has a certificate in business and is a former administrator at the University of Oregon. She is a contributing writer to the Huffington Post, MSNBC, and the Chronicle of Higher Education's Vitae. After directly working with the New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, she helped write the bipartisan Campus Accountability and Safety Act. And in 2013, she was listed alongside President Barack Obama as one of the most influential forces in higher education. And she is featured in the campus sexual assault documentary, The Hunting Ground. Did anyone see that last night at Davis campus? Well, if you haven't seen it, go. I believe it's still on Netflix. Check it out. It's definitely a must-see. And Andrea L. Pino is also a co-founder of End Rape on Campus and the director of policy and support. She attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she majored in political science. Her activism has been featured in the New York Times, Vogue, CNN, Good Morning America, as well as many other media outlets. She has appeared as a guest on the Melissa Harris Perry Show and is a contributor to the Huffington Post. In 2013, she became the first student featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education's influence list and was listed on the Huffington Post Most Influential Forces in Higher Education list. Her work and personal journey is prominently featured in the documentary The Hunting Ground, which we already talked about. Go see it. We are incredibly excited and honored to have these women join us here at Weber State. Seriously, they're a huge deal. You have no idea. And they're helping us to ensure that our community is truly safe at Weber. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having us here. I do want to first say I'm very excited to be back in Utah. It's a gorgeous state, and I apologize in advance if my enthusiasm doesn't come through. I woke up with the flu this morning, so I'm going to try to practice what I preach and engage in a little bit of self-care, so if I need to run outside, you know why. It's not because I'm leaving you off. I promise I'll come back. So again, my name is Annie Clark, and thank you so much for having us, and thank you for being here this morning. Being present and showing up is, I mean, that is activism in and of itself.
Yeah, so I was thinking the last time we were in Utah was actually for Sundance, right across the street. It was our first time showing the hunting ground to the world, and since then, the film has been all around the world, and our journey itself has changed a lot. So we hope to share a little bit of that with you today.
Cool. A little bit just to reinforce, if you need to step out, get a drink of water, talk to someone, I'm not going to think you're rude either. So please do what you can to make sure you're taking care of yourself. A little bit of a roadmap of what we'll be talking about today. Just a bit of background about us. How many people I didn't see the hands. How many people have seen the hunting ground? Oh, great. So now you just get to hear us again. So we can skip a little bit of that. And then just talk a little bit about facts about sexual assault on college campus. And what we know about violence, it happens much, much earlier, much later. And this is only a screenshot and actually a reflection of our larger culture. Talking a little bit about the student movement, how we came to be where we are today. Also, a big chunk on student rights, so laws. We'll not get too nerdy with you, but just making sure that you do know what your rights are, and then talk about what you can do and how to support survivors on your campus.
So for those of you that are really nerdy, I implore you to come join us this evening, where I will talk about my personal research interest in political science, which is around media framing and policy change, which we will not get to talk about this time. So you will not get to hear about Game of Thrones, which I talk about in that talk. So if you are interested in Game of Thrones, I recommend you come to that one this evening.
So, and also after this talk, and then later tonight, we'll be talking about and signing copies of our book called We Believe You. And a little bit of the background here was that after the hunting ground, we had a platform, and we wanted to give survivors a way to talk about their experiences that wasn't filtered by the media. And also, that was a more accurate representation of who sexual violence impacts. And so we wanted to talk about race and the intersections of gender identity and sexual orientation and religion and childhood trauma and everything that you can't really fit in a 90-minute film, and really give people their own voices. And so I do want to say too that I am it's weird to say you're a survivor, but also in a position of privilege, and I am very much so. And that's a lot because the media listens to people who look like me. And the face of sexual assault on college campuses oftentimes people think are just white blonde girls, and that's not the reality. And so anybody can be a survivor, and we wrote this because we wanted to reflect the reality and give people that platform. Okay, so a little bit about us and where we came from. So I grew up in North Carolina, which is the South, which is like where your vegetables have meat in them, like that type of Southern. And I was in a suburbia, essentially, and I had my two things that I loved, which were sports and school. And those things I could control. I was still probably am, pretty type A, and wanting to make a difference and be an advocate, and I thought I knew, what to do about these issues. And so I graduated. I actually wanted to move to the West Coast, because I told you it is so pretty out here, to go to school, and financially that didn't make sense. So I ended up being very fortunate that one of the best universities in the country was in my backyard. And so it was probably one of the first times I admitted to my mother that she was right when she told me I should go there. And I did have a really good experience and learned a lot. But I was a first-year student, and I was out, and I was sexually assaulted. And I thought for a very long time, and by long I mean a few months probably, that I could bury it, that I was in control, and I didn't want to have to face and think about what happened to me. But it started to affect me academically. And so I went to my university to ask for help. And when that happened, the person I told looked at me. She told me that rape was like a football game. I was the quarterback in charge of my experience. What would I have done differently or should have done differently in that situation? And as an 18-year-old student, I didn't know what the right response was, but I knew that wasn't it. And so I became more involved on campus and making sure that people who were reporting were not getting victim-blaming responses. And I honestly, I get asked about that a lot. Do you think this person was being malicious? And I say, no, I think it's just very misinformed. And I think that reflects a lot of our society, that we do still blame the victim. What were you wearing? What were you drinking? As opposed to, it's not your fault, and how can I help you? And so I created a system, a blind reporting system, thinking about, like, if you ever been to a restaurant and there's like those comment cards you can leave anonymously, thought, what if survivors could ask for help that way so they didn't have to face somebody? And that might not be right for everyone, but I knew I would have appreciated that option. Excuse me. So that's what I created with help from our Dean of Students office. I got permission to put these boxes of resources and places where students could report in our gyms and our student union, and that's how more people started reaching out.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very different scenario. So I am from Miami, Florida. I'm from Little Havana, which is where all the Cubans are from. And I feel I didn't really become a minority until I left Miami. I knew two things very well, and that was hurricanes and my schoolwork. I lived through Hurricane Andrew, which was a big deal until Katrina came. And I think what was really interesting is that people from my hometown didn't leave. Nobody left. I mean, everyone, our neighbors' kids were all part of the same neighborhood. My grandfather was like, the big guy in town who helped everyone learn how to vote and helped drive them to the polls. And, pretty early on, I knew that I wanted to leave. And it wasn't because I didn't love living at home. It was because I felt like I wanted to be more academically challenged. So when I was in 6th grade, I discovered Gilmore Girls, which is now coming back. And when I discovered Gilmore Girls, I'm like, oh my God, I want to go to Yale like Rory Gilmore. This was actually my dream. My first ever credit card purchase on eBay was a Yale sweatshirt, which ended up being fake, but I thought it was great. And for my 15th birthday, I asked my parents to take me on a college road trip. So I had only been to 2 states at that time. I had been to Georgia, and I had been to North Carolina, and I loved North Carolina. But again, I wanted to go to Yale because that's where I was shooting. So when we did our college road trip, the first school we actually stopped at was the University of North Carolina. And I mainly stopped there, confession, because Mia Hamm went there. So I figured, oh, cool, I'm going to go to the school where Mia Hamm went. So when I ended up touring it, I completely fell in love with it, and not just with, this really vibrant sports culture, but also with the history of activism and leadership at the school. So again, I still wanted to go to Yale. So when I went to Yale, I didn't feel like I belonged there, and I think that's something that is incredibly important with my story, is that I felt like a minority right away. So when I ended up applying to UNC, I didn't think I would get in because only 700 out-of-state students get into UNC, but I did. And I felt like I had defeated all these odds to get in, but pretty quickly I felt like I didn't belong there either. So the way I tried to compensate with it was the same way I had done in high school, which is to get involved in all these different leadership activities. I got involved in student government, I got involved in residence life, I became a residence hall governor. I felt that if I learned my school really well, I would feel like I belonged. And I did, I definitely did. And I made some incredible friends, and I knew that I had made the right decision to go to UNC. But my sophomore year, actually, right after I was hired as a resident assistant, I was sexually assaulted at an off-campus party. And I thought I knew my school really well. I was giving tours, I knew the ins and out of every single department, but I didn't know what to do when something like this happened to me. And that's mainly because I was raised Catholic and we didn't talk about these things. And the idea of admitting that something like this happened to me was impossible. So I thought to blame myself and keep quiet about it. I decided to delve into my academics and just not think about what happened. And that didn't end up working out very well because I started struggling in my classes. So I decided that maybe if I would drop a class, I could get along with it. And I did. I tried dropping a class, and I was told that maybe I just couldn't handle Carolina and I was just being lazy. So having worked so hard to get there, that was the worst thing I could have heard, not just because I was sexually assaulted, but because it was so difficult for a person like me to go to a school like UNC. So I ended up actually walking into the student union, and I discovered these boxes where it said, if you've been sexually assaulted, consider anonymously reporting. And I did so. I filled out the box when I was in the bathroom stall. And then I did some research, and I found out that those boxes were created by a student named Annie Clark.
And so we connected. And at this time I graduated, I was a senior when Andrea was a first-year student, and I was actually now a low-level administrator at the University of Oregon. And the stories that I were hearing from my students sounded very, very familiar. They didn't know where to go, they didn't know what their resources were, there was a lot of self-blame. And around this time, I'm getting involved on the Oregon campus, I hear from Andrea. She's like, okay, nothing's gotten better. We might have a box system, we might have policy, but we need to do something about culture change. And so we started, and this is where you'll hear, if you come tonight, just about media framing and a lot of the research we did. So we started first, we wanted to understand the reality of what sexual violence looked like on college campuses, what our rights were, and then how could we put all of that together to create some sort of a national movement. And it was a lot of work and a lot of research. It was probably like the biggest dissertation ever. But this is what we learned, that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men will either graduate, drop out, or transfer with the title of sexual assault survivor. And that's in this country. And so a lot of schools, they'll say, well, our school's not featured in the hunting ground, or we haven't had this case. This is a problem everywhere. And if your school's not on a list, that doesn't matter. It just means somebody's called attention to the problem. And so we really like to work with administrators. I'm very happy to see the president and so many other faculty members here, just because sometimes people are like, oh, what are you gonna do? But we really wanna work with schools, with administrators, with faculty members to make campuses safer. So here are some of the other statistics that we learned.
All right, so when I was kind of a young political science student who was really interested into research, one of the things that I was really fascinated over was just the complete lack of data and conversation around survivors in general. Like, we knew that this was happening to so many people, but why wasn't it considered an epidemic? Why wasn't it something that every single student knew about? So what we found out pretty quickly is that survivors of color are even more likely to be sexually assaulted, which again, it's so important to advocate for cultural competency in your administration, because again, like, how is someone supposed to understand what it's like for a survivor of color to come forward if they don't understand their experience? But what we do know is that 40% of black women are likely to be sexually assaulted before they turn 18. And this number is even higher if they happen to identify as LGBT, and we'll talk more about the queer community in particular. But what was interesting, what we learned too, is that among Asian and Pacific Islander women, they're actually the least likely to come forward. So if you do pick up our book, the 2 survivors that identify as East Asian in our book, they talk about the similar patterns of not feeling safe coming forward because of backlash from their community. So in my community, in the Latinx community, we know that there's a very high percentage of intimate partner violence. And what's incredibly interesting, with specifically undocumented Latino immigrants in particular, they're even less likely to come forward because there is this fear of deportation. So there are certain visas that you can get. There's a very low number available. So again, usually by this time of the year, there are no more visas available for undocumented survivors who want to come forward. So again, there's this added barrier of not feeling safe coming to the police because you might be deported if you report your sexual assault. So the highest rate of sexual violence is in the Native American community, and this isn't just in the US, but actually it's the same thing in Canada, it's the same thing in Australia. We see that there's this astronomical number of Native survivors that not just that experience sexual assault, but that also go missing or end up murdered, and there's no conversation around it. And we'll talk a little bit about the media again tonight, but I'm particularly really passionate about Native survivors because we had a survivor at UNC who was raped and murdered in 2012, whose case is still cold, and her whole tribe in North Carolina has tried to advocate to get some type of justice, and there was actually recently a 2020 special on it. Her name is Faith Hedgepeth. But again, there's no conversation around it. But there are so many people like Faith, not just at universities, but all around the country who experience sexual violence or who end up missing or murdered, and there's absolutely no conversation from the government. So it's so important to recognize, again, that there are certain populations who are getting even less coverage when it comes to sexual violence.
Another community is the LGBT community. And recently there was some data on this from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but it's not nearly enough. And we bring up these rates here because not only are they higher, but particularly in a marginalized community, when you're making policy, those people need to be at the table and their experiences need to be centered. And a real life example of when this policy committee was not inclusive was the first time UNC tried to remake its policy after coming forward and they said, okay, we'll do something. And it was typically the upper echelons of the university administration, and they said, okay, we know this is a problem, so we have to hire more people. And we're like, great. They hired 4 white men for survivor support. And so thinking about who's at that table, who's making those decisions are really, really important. And so we'll also talk about how do you do that, and how is your community in some ways maybe already doing it. Do you have confidential advisors that have drop-in hours at your diversity or multicultural center or at your LGBT center? And how are these streamlines? Because if you're a man, you might not want to go to the women's center if that's how you identify. And so just really making sure that these numbers are highlighted is important.
So there is a huge epidemic with violence committed towards trans women of color in particular. There was actually one who was just found murdered yesterday in Cleveland. Her name is Brandy Brenso. And again, we just aren't seeing the coverage being reflected over just how many trans women of color are targeted every day because of who they are. We do know that is the largest community that is targeted by violence, and they're actually the least likely to survive. So in our book, we actually do have the narrative of a trans woman of color. And one of the main things that she talks about is feeling like she's the only one, because there's this, collective problem of feeling unsafe coming out as transgender, and this bigger problem of feeling unsafe coming out as a transgender survivor in the survivor community. Unfortunately, we have been to many universities in which there doesn't seem to be a conversation around trans women at all. We've been at universities where we've heard from trans survivors that they feel like they can't come forward. And actually, in this particular case involving the student in our book, her name is Princess. She was told at the Women's Center that her experience didn't count because she was a trans woman. Granted, that was in 2014, but again, this is still happening at many universities. And actually, there are some universities who are actually asking for religious waivers so that they don't have to accommodate queer students, period. That list is currently public, but some of the schools that you would think of are Notre Dame, Gonzaga, that were plaintiffs in the Hobby Lobby case and who are asking for waivers based on religious freedom. So unfortunately, this is still happening. There is a Supreme Court case right now out of North Carolina, actually, because of the very controversial House Bill 2, that might actually completely radically change the way that we don't just see Title IX, but the way that we actually see gender protections, period. So that might actually completely transform the way that trans survivors are protected. But as of right now, unfortunately, a lot of schools are still asking for waivers to not accommodate trans survivors.
Cool. And so something we know about sexual violence in general, it impacts people emotionally, mentally, interpersonally, and it impacts people differently. There's no one right way to heal, and that path is not linear. And so what we do see are certain trends, particularly in academia. Over about a third of survivors report that they suffer academically. And I don't know if y'all remember the Bill Cosby cover of, I think it was the New York magazine, where you had the names of and the faces of all of the women who accused Cosby, and then there was this hashtag that went sort of viral after that on Twitter where there was an empty space, and so it was the empty chair. And that's sort of what we use as a symbol or a representation about how many survivors aren't in this room or aren't in your classes because of either dropping out or just not being supported. And so how do we make sure that, first of all, people aren't being assaulted, but if they are, they're in a community of support? And so thinking about empty chairs at events like these, who's coming, who's being reached out to, but also in your classrooms and how professors are responding to empty chairs. So just think about that and throughout the rest of this.
And also, there actually hasn't been a big study looking at how many students do end up dropping because of experiencing sexual violence. I do think it will raise this bigger question of, is Title IX working if students' actual academic opportunities are being hindered by sexual violence? So it has been talked about by many different statistics bureaus to look at, again, what the academic impact is long-term of sexual violence. We do know anecdotally, and if you pick up our book again, there are a lot of survivors in there that ended up dropping out and ended up completely changing their academic trajectories because of experiencing sexual violence. So we do know that sexual violence is very underreported, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happens when survivors come forward to the police a little later in the presentation. But it is a very small percentage of sexual assault cases on campus that are reported. So again, it's very difficult for us to even assess the bigger problem of sexual violence if there are these bigger hindrances preventing survivors from coming forward in the first place.
And you'll see different numbers on this. Some are high as 12 to 15%. It really just depends on the metric used. And so the overarching point is it's very, very low. And so that means it could be higher. And something we'll talk about when we discuss the Clery Act, it's a lot of schools, they'll say our school is so safe, we've had 0 reported sexual assaults. And that's a red flag. That either means students don't feel safe coming forward, they don't know where to come forward, or the school is intentionally or unintentionally underreporting those numbers. And so it's hard to say if higher numbers, if that is actually an increase in sexual assault or just an increase of people feeling like they have resources and coming forward. So low numbers are, I would just say, always a red flag because statistically, at any university, that's not possible. So we went into our research mode after we sort of got the lay of the land, the scope of the problem, realizing, yes, it actually is an epidemic. It's not being framed like that in the media. It's being framed very individually. But we know it's a problem, statistically and anecdotally and personally. And so we said, what are the rights that we have? We're not lawyers, but we had a pretty good education and we can do some research. And one of the first laws we encountered was Title IX. And a lot of people, especially if I were to ask this 3 years ago, you hear Title IX, you think sports and sports equity and more women's teams. But actually, this is really all Title IX says. It's that short. It's educational equity and access to education regardless of sex, and it's actually been interpreted to mean gender as well. And so what we learned, there was a case, I'll just talk about it. There's a case called Alexander versus Yale that we discovered. And that was in Yale, and you had 5 women, Catherine McKinnon being one of them, who argued that they did not have an equal access to education because they were being harassed by their male peers and male professors, and therefore their educational experience was not the same as that of their male peers. And so learning that and really standing on their shoulders, we said, of course, if you can't learn if you're being harassed, you can't learn if you're being sexually assaulted or sitting next to your perpetrator. And so using that sort of as a framework, we said maybe Title IX can help us in this way too. And understanding that it wasn't a perfect law, but it was a vehicle that anyone had access to. And because it's a civil rights law, you can file a complaint and you don't need to be a lawyer. And so one of the reasons we chose this as one of our main vehicles is because it was accessible to anyone.
All right, so I do want to say that I actually learned about Title IX because of my assigned reading. So make sure you read your assigned reading. You might learn something incredible, right? So actually, it was one of the first things I had to read for one of my political theory classes. And what I found really interesting is that it did apply so much to what I was seeing in my everyday environment. It wasn't just me that was sexually assaulted. A lot of my friends were actually, a majority of my hallmates were sexually assaulted before we finished our sophomore year. So again, when reading, what I was assigned to read in my classroom, I learned that this stuff was still happening and this law was still applicable. So I started asking these questions, like why is it that I, as an undergraduate student, happen to have picked up Title IX and learned about it, and this wasn't a conversation among my peers and definitely not among my administrators. So what we did learn is that as of 2011, which we'll talk a little bit about the timeline of Title IX, universities are required to do these things. So in particular, I do want to mention, addressing sexual violence. So this, again, it's only been really since 2011, so this has actually been a bigger conversation around sexual assault. Sexual assault has always happened at universities, even before they were integrated. That's always been an excuse. If only women didn't come to university, this wouldn't happen. But again, this has been happening, and actually not just at universities, but in the military. This is an institutional problem, and it's really about power, and not really just about the university itself. But again, universities are required to take corrective action against harassment and sexual assault. So it doesn't have to just be, kind of this higher grade of violence. It doesn't have to be like, what is the most egregious violence that it takes for a university to address? It's not like it's a scale. Universities have to address all different types of harassment complaints. This includes stalking, it includes lewd comments, it includes, kind of misplaced among faculty, misconduct among faculty. It's all these different degrees of harassment, because this creates an unequal climate. So it was learning that for me that was transformative, because I realized that, again, like, it wasn't really my fault that I was struggling academically. It was the fact that I was experiencing a hostile climate that prevented me from being a student.
And a lot of times people will say, well, is it a one-time event, a one-time sexual assault, one-time comment? And no, think about everything you do or don't do in your daily life because you're thinking about not getting assaulted. It could mean the way you walk around campus, or you don't go to a certain place at night, or you don't stay in the library late at night because you don't want to go home at 1 o'clock in the morning. So all of these things go to impact educational equity. So just thinking about it much more broadly than just a one-time instance of sexual violence.
And also, I do want to point out too. So we had this really great interview a few months ago where this reporter asked us if we were overgeneralizing when we said that women in the STEM fields have it really hard, and he said that he didn't have a really hard time in college. So how could has it changed, or is it that our profession has made us more hypersensitive towards sexual violence? And one, that was ridiculous. Two, I said, actually, I've been hypersensitive since I came out of my mother's womb, because I've been taught to avoid violence done onto my body literally since I was born. And I think what's really interesting is, again, like, how many students don't end up going to the STEM fields because they feel that they're going to be unsafe? How many students end up dropping out of PhD programs, master's programs, because they feel as if their professors coming on to them or their peers are making them uncomfortable or not valuing their work? And what's also important too is that universities can't retaliate against students that come forward. So this is especially, I know it's a big concern among grad students. There's actually a case now happening in Canada involving a grad student. But again, grad students are even less likely to come forward because it's much more intimate in their circles, or much fewer people involved, and everyone's going to know that this happened. So again, like, Title IX has this very, very vast application, but it still is this very tiny law. So again, unfortunately, it does vary university in the way that it's implemented.
This is just to reiterate something the Department of Education said, is that Title IX covers all students. It covers male students, LGBT-identified students, and there are those certain schools that have requested religious waivers to say we don't have to do this. The Department of Education has not released the names of those schools, at least up until a few days ago, unless they have in the past few days, and I apologize if that has happened. But this is just a reminder that it protects all students. And this is just a little, very, very, very condensed timeline. And what is of note is that most of the cases we have, all the case law is K through 12. A lot of it is harassment in schools. And so it's shoehorned into this harassment framework, and then higher ed's interpreting it. That was the case I was talking about, Alexander versus Yale, one of the first lawsuits. The Dear Colleague letter, which was the reminder to schools that they had to address sexual violence under Title IX. And then there have been a number of complaints. We just put that there because it was one of the first filings in which you had, and this is some of the research that we did, you had a good media frame, you had people who were public, and you had legal action to go with it. So you had media and legal. And so a lot of times survivors or people who file complaints, nobody knew about it because nobody wants to say, yes, I did this. And it was only up until activists required or requested very strongly and protested that the department release the names of the schools that were under investigation, arguing that it shouldn't be incumbent upon a victim of discrimination or violence to reveal that information.
So actually, since that list was publicized, I believe it came out in 2014, there are about 50. Now there are well over 200 schools that are under investigation. So that list is ever increasing. So every once in a while, a school will come off, then come back on. So it is changing every day. So it's hard for us to give you a full number. It's around 200 and something. But more and more actors are finding out what their rights are, so that number is increasing.
So this is a condensed version of a law called the Clery Act, and it is named after a woman named Jean Clery who was raped and murdered at Lehigh University. And when that happened, the school didn't tell anybody. And so her parents, very fierce advocates, decided that there should be some sort of crime safety law. So if something happened on campus, the community should know about it so they can react accordingly. And so the Clery Act does a few things. The first, it requires schools to release crime statistics data to the Department of Education, and that should be publicly available. And there's a list of crimes that include murder, sexual violence. It just recently updated to include stalking and dating violence. But you can go online and you should be able to find those numbers within a few clicks. It also requires that there's a daily crime log kept there, and then timely warnings and emergency notifications. So that basically was letting people know if there's an imminent threat or danger on campus. So very much in the same way that if there was a tornado coming through campus, you would want your administration to know about it. Same thing if there was an active shooter. And so that law is in place for that reason. It also, under the updated requirements, requires that training be ongoing. So not just a 5-minute thing at orientation, but continually ongoing and improving.
So you actually are able to file a Clery complaint and a Title IX complaint. All the students that we've worked with have filed both. So I did not discover the Clery Act in my personal political science research, but it was really interesting is that there actually had not been any public filed complaints up until our case. So our case was the first publicly filed Clery complaint. So before our complaint, a lot of the investigations were conducted by the department itself. So there was a complaint process, but no one knew about it. Since then, they now have hired more staff, and there actually is a more formal Clery complaint process. But until 2013, it really wasn't there.
Yeah, and a caveat with this law, though, which is why you have to be very careful when comparing schools and looking at the crime numbers, is that it's a geography-based law. And there's a 300 and something page handbook that tells you what is Clery reportable geography. And it's basically university campus or university-owned property, and then things that are adjacent, and then there's rules about parking lots and things like that. But if you go to a school that's a big commuter school, or where a lot of students live in privately owned apartment buildings across the street, things that happen there do not have to be counted if they're not on campus. That doesn't mean the school still doesn't have to follow Title IX and other things, but it's an important caveat. This is also something we discovered called the Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights. And it's a little outdated in its language, I think. But basically, it just means it shouldn't be incumbent on the survivor to go do a scavenger hunt to figure out all of these things. But they should be told that they have the right to also notify law enforcement if they want to. They shouldn't be dissuaded from doing so, and also equity and the adjudication process. So it doesn't say like you get 3 witnesses and you get 3 witnesses. It says it has to be equal, and rights that are afforded to one side have to be afforded to the other.
All right, so Title II. So in a lot of our presentations, a lot of folks have no idea what Title II is. So what's interesting is that Title II is under the American with Disabilities Act. So what a lot of folks don't understand is that they're beyond physical disabilities, psychiatric disabilities are also covered under Title II. So actually a lot of college students exhibit ADA protected disabilities that they don't even know that they can get accommodations for. This includes depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, PTSD in particular. And a lot of students blame themselves for not being able to get out of bed or not being able to keep up with their coursework, when in reality they could actually get accommodations by their university if they only knew about them. So in my case, I didn't know that I could get accommodations up until my junior year. I had no idea that I could get my tests moved, or I could take them in a different place where I didn't feel as triggered. I didn't know that I could get my papers, my paper extensions for the deadline. I didn't know that I could get medical withdrawals or medical incompletes. And I ended up dropping 11 classes by the time I finished at Carolina. Most of those I wouldn't have had to drop had I had accommodations. I had professors asking me for doctor's notes about my panic attacks. I had professors telling me that I couldn't keep up and I didn't understand feminism, which was my personal favorite. And I was saying that I was exhibiting these certain symptoms, which later became diagnosed as PTSD, and no one thought to tell me that I could get accommodations. And it was actually a very simple process. I would show up to the accessibility center, I would say I had a disability, and that was it. And I was registered for the entirety of my time as a student. When I became an RA, I helped a lot of my students get accommodations, and they told me that that was the reason they actually ended up staying there or ended up not dropping out or changing their major, because they had those accommodations. So these accommodations could actually completely transform a disabled student's time at their university. It could determine whether they want to go to grad school or even stay on campus. But unfortunately, a lot of administrators don't think to work with the disability center. They're oftentimes in the margins of campus and not kept within the conversation. At Carolina, for example, a lot of students still don't know that they have certain protections if they develop depression or PTSD. And what's interesting about sexual assault is actually that sexual assault survivors have an even higher likelihood of developing PTSD than combat veterans. But there's oftentimes not this conversation, to connect Title IX and Title II.
So another civil right is Title VI. Some of you might be familiar with this. And it just says you cannot be denied equitable services and be excluded based on race, color, national origin. And so what we often see yet again is here's another law that students, particularly students of color, marginalized already on campus, don't know that it exists. And so we've had cases we filed with the Department of Education on the basis of Title VI, Title II, and Title IX. But Title IX is the only one that's getting coverage. We had one case, and I'm allowed to share it, where the defense was he's a nice white dude, essentially, who's going into the military. Your race is not an excuse for a felony. But this is what their defense was, and they argued. And so we filed the case under Title IX and Title VI with this. And so what Andrea was saying, thinking about how these laws intersect is really important, not just in the law, but physically on campus. And what we often see are these centers are physically, geographically removed from one another and removed from the center of campus where the most power is. And so you have students walking to different places, and those places are often siloed and aren't communicating with one another. And so faculty, academic advisors, counselors should all know that these laws exist, and all of these people should be in communication and streamlined. This is just a little diagram of how the Department of Education's process works in terms of filing complaints. And there's lots of different steps, but this is the basic model here. So you have at the top the Department of Education, and then OCR, the Office for Civil Rights. They oversee civil rights legislation and a few other things like the Boy Scout Equality Act. But their power is limited in that if a school is found in violation, they can do this nuclear option of revoking all federal funding, which often is going to harm the very students they were trying to help, or basically sit down with the school and work out something where they promise to be better. And federal funding has never been taken away. And so there are some advocacy groups right now that are arguing that the department should have intermediate fining or sanctioning power just to have a little bit more teeth in enforcement. And then but that hasn't happened yet. And then on the other side, you have the Clery Compliance Division, which is actually overseen by Federal Student Aid, which is an interesting place, but it's also because they can fine. So Clery can fine up to $35,000 per violation. So, for example, a Clery complaint might look like, I was on campus, I was assaulted, I reported it to the dean of students, my friend did too, their Clery report still says 0 for this year. And so that's how some students have been able to hold their schools accountable for statistics as sort of a means in to have better improved policies. Something to know as well is the statute of limitations for complaints on OCR right now is 180 days, which is incredibly short. And that is 180 days since the last violation of civil rights, whereas Clery does not have a statute of limitations at all. So when the law was enacted, you can file a complaint from 1995. You just can't do it retroactively before it was passed.
And also what's important to note is that although this process is much more accessible than, say, filing a civil lawsuit for a lot of folks, unfortunately there is a huge waiting list for these cases to be investigated. So for example, our case is still under investigation. We filed it in 2013. The average wait is somewhere between 4 to 5 years for the closure of that investigation. So we're no longer at UNC. Actually, nobody who was in our complaint is still at UNC, and that's actually pretty common for a lot of cases. It'll take years before they hear anything. So a lot of survivors that actually file complaints don't do so because they're seeking personal justice, but rather they actually want to help make their school better. And that's actually what Annie and I said when we first came forward, that we were doing this for the class of 2020, which, by the way, is now on campus. And although things are getting better, this public accountability is so important because unless we keep talking about this conversation, unfortunately, every year students will forget about it. Every new class of first-year students will not know what happened before. So it's so important for these investigations do keep this conversation going on campuses.
Cool. Awareness versus accountability. So Andrea has this mission that she wants to change Sexual Assault Awareness Month to Sexual Assault Accountability Month. Because I think we're all pretty much aware. Like, we know it happens, right? So, like, what are we doing about it? How do we hold people accountable? And so what we want to talk about is both legislatively and culturally, how do we move from this compliance framework, this mentality of checking the box to make sure that our school names aren't in the newspaper, to actually working towards commitment for helping students. So this is a little house, and if you think about it as such, the bottom is non-compliance. And there were a lot of schools, particularly in the early 2000s, and still some that are completely not compliant on paper, not compliant at all. And so that's the baseline. That's like where we're starting from in some cases. But then you move up to compliance, and that's when 2011, 2012, 2013, a lot of people said, oh shoot, we should be doing something about this to make sure that they were in compliance with federal regulations, but did things like give somebody that already had 25 jobs the additional job of Title IX coordinator. And so on paper, they have that checked off, but is that person really serving students? And I know some schools don't have the capacity to have all of these programs, but there's still ways that you can move towards commitment rather than compliance. And a good example of this is a case of our first cases that we worked on, and I have permission again to tell the story. Her name is Julia Dixon, and she is a wonderful advocate. But she was sexually assaulted, went to her school, reported it, and asked for the resources that were listed in the school's policy. Come to find out, the policy, those resources did not exist. The building names did not even exist because the school had plagiarized their policy from another school. And so even though they checked the box, they had a policy, it wasn't really committing to the welfare of their students at all. So her line that I always say is best practices are only best when they're practiced. And that's something that I think holds true for all of these cases. And we can have very nice policies on paper, but unless they're implemented in an informed, intersectional way that's actually benefiting the students, it's not really worth the paper it's written on. And so we can talk about, baseline, like what are best practices nationally, but also you can't cookie cutter everything. Best practices for this campus are gonna look different from another campus, and that's why you need your students, who are your experts. You are the experts at the table.
So it is important. We often ask students and faculty, especially, to ask the hard questions, because again, sometimes things will look pretty great on paper, but when you start asking those hard questions, you recognize that there really are some missing gaps in how the university could be doing this better. So one of the first things we ask, is the university committed to supporting survivors? Do you feel there's this constant message of support? And unfortunately, a lot of universities, that constant message of support is usually student run, and it's usually only in the months of October and April. And sexual violence happens all year round. It doesn't just happen in April and October. So it's so important to think about how it is that universities could be putting more funding into having constant programming to make sure students are aware of their rights and aware that they will be believed if they come forward. So, beyond that too is do students know that they have rights to accommodations? Like I said, a lot of students probably don't know about their rights under Title II. A lot of students don't know that if they're struggling academically and have developed depression or anxiety or PTSD as a result of sexual assault, if they're struggling academically, they have a right to accommodations. Like, do any of your friends feel like they want to drop out or not continue or drop out of their classes because they feel like they can't keep up? Like, what about asking them if they know what their rights are under Title II? Like, oftentimes, again, like asking those hard questions will reveal these bigger conversations that unfortunately a lot of schools aren't having. And then, of course, the last two, like, are marginalized students feeling supported? Unfortunately, a lot of this conversation around sexual assault, and not just campus sexual assault, but all sexual assault, is oftentimes very heterosexual and very white. Unfortunately, it does not look into many different types of experiences, in particular experiences of the LGBT community. So again, like, why isn't it that more flyers aren't showcasing different types of experiences, or even the way we talk about sexual assault? How is that we can be conscious of the way that we refer to pronouns, and to make sure that it's much more inclusive when we think about the way we talk about it. And the last thing is, do students feel safe coming forward? And that's oftentimes a very, very hard question. Like, if you experience sexual assault, would you feel safe going forward to the police? Would you feel safe coming forward to the school? And there's not always an easy answer for that question, because it's very difficult to measure the safety the students feel coming forward. But asking that hard question often leads the conversation towards thinking of how it is that you can make students feel safer when they come forward.
And so oftentimes we get a question saying, why are schools even handling this? Why doesn't everybody just go to the police? It's a crime. And, for a lot of people, they don't know about Title IX, that the school has got to federally, legally do something. But also, survivors a lot of times don't feel comfortable going to the police. And you can see some of the statistics up here. But in particular, survivors of color, thinking about what the police, what it looks like right now in our country. And would you feel safe, knocking on the door and reporting to somebody who looks like the people you are seeing on TV shoot other people? And so really asking those hard intersectional questions is incredibly important. Another thing that Andrea will talk about is institutional betrayal. And what we know, and this is out of Michigan research, shows that survivors who go for...
I got it. Anyway,
Sorry.
so survivors who go forward are actually much more likely to have worse mental health outcomes if they wouldn't report at all. So I do want to highlight these three statistics. So again, like, there's this very high percentage that survivors who go to the police will be victim blamed. And I actually do recommend looking at this entire study from Rebecca Campbell at Michigan State, because it does look at specific questions they're asked. Like, how many times are they asked what they're wearing? How many times are they asked what they had to drink? How many times are they asked what they could have done differently? And unfortunately, it is an incredibly high percentage that survivors are going to be asked these questions. So what does that lead to? It leads to 80% not wanting to ever seek help from anybody ever again. And this isn't just help from law enforcement, but help, period. They'll likely never talk to anyone else about their experience.
And what we know that means, though, is there's so much room for improvement, right? If your mental health is worse after reporting, there's a huge gap of where we can improve that experience. And so institutional betrayal, this was a term coined by Jennifer Freed out of the University of Oregon that talks about systemic betrayal in terms of not just a college campus, but it could be any institution. So you think the church, the military, your family, any institution where if something happens to you and you report or you tell this institution that you have been harmed, and they respond by harming you back. And that's what we see a lot in terms of students who come forward on college campuses.
So students that do experience that secondary betrayal are actually, more likely to develop PTSD, depression, and anxiety than students that do not, that actually have a positive experience. So again, that first experience could actually completely change not just the academic trajectory, but also the mental health trajectory of the person coming forward. So it's so important to think about not just the individual perpetrator, because again, a lot of these conversations around sexual assault are so focused on, being the bystander in terms of the individual incident, but it's so important to be the bystander in these bigger conversations. How are friends responding to the survivor? How is it that you can, make sure that the school is much more educated in the way they talk to survivors? Like, again, it's not just the individual perpetrator we have to worry about. It's our bigger society that is making it difficult for survivors to not just survive, but to thrive after they experience sexual violence.
Cool. So this is a little bit what Andrea was just saying, having a culture of accountability, not just the bystander training that teaches you what to do on Friday night at that party, But what do you do when you're sitting down with your buddies and somebody said, oh, that test raped me? Or you're watching football and there's rape metaphors used. Calling out those things and making sure to hold each other accountable, because it doesn't just start, with this instance. A lot of people are like, how, Brock Turner, anybody? California.
We'll talk about Brock Turner tonight.
We all know this name. Yeah, we'll talk about it in terms of media. But people are like, I'm so surprised. I'm like, no, it's just a very ugly reflection of the culture and the way that we have socialized our young men and boys. For faculty in the room, I always say this because I really want somebody to do a study of how many hours are lost in this country in girls' education because they are pulled out of their chemistry classes or their reading classes because their shorts are too short or their shoulders are showing. And then we give that message to boys that says, you can't control yourself. She's too distracting. And that puts the message back on young girls blaming themselves. Fast forward and you have, cases like Brock Turner, and the police go, well, what did you expect dressed like that? What were you wearing? And so this is really a continuum. This is about having that call-out culture, about starting much earlier in middle school and elementary school, talking about bodily autonomy, respect, and consent. If the first time we're talking about this is at orientation, it's way too late.
And again, this is an everyday conversation, and we'll talk a little bit more about, this concept of everyday activism. But activism should not be easy. It's not something that you just you go to a parade or you go to a fundraiser and you're an activist today. It's an incredibly difficult process. I mean, even for us, we are constantly learning every day how to become better activists. But like Annie said, it has to start so much earlier. We need to start having these conversations with not just our kids, but any young person in our lives. I mean, I oftentimes use this concept of, I have a German Shepherd and she's really cute, and everyone thinks she's adorable and they want to pet her. So little girls are much more likely to ask me to pet my dog than little boys are. I've had little boys try to ride my dog. I've had little boys pull her tail, throw rocks at her, bark at her, scream at her. And usually the parents will just sit there and laugh, oh, he's just a boy, he doesn't know what he's doing. And it's oh, he's gonna get his face bitten off, Not by my dog, but probably by somebody else. And I think it's very unfortunate, because were that to happen, whose fault would it be? It would be the dog's fault, it would be the owner's fault. But unfortunately, there's not this call to think about telling our boys, talking to our boys about consent, talking to our boys about, the same conversations that I had as a young girl, the amount of times I had to ask to cross the street, the amount of times I had to ask to express my opinion. These are oftentimes not conversations that little boys are having. So again, how does this escalate when they get to college? When they get to college and, they're dared by someone to grab somebody's butt and they laugh about it and nothing's done about it. And then it ends up becoming a dare when someone's pledging into a fraternity, to become a pledge, you have to make sure you have sex with 5 girls tonight. And it's all a joke. It's part of your pledging process. You're hanging out with your brothers, and no one thinks that's possibly a sexual assault. So again, unfortunately, these conversations aren't talked about when they're smaller things and they're smaller conversations, and they oftentimes do create that fertile ground to allow sex assault to happen.
Yeah. And so in terms of everyday activism, there are things that all of us can be doing every single day. And whether that means teaching our kids about consent, or if you are a lawyer, talking about this with your clients, or whatever your profession is, having this conversation. If you are a doctor, making sure that the people in your space are treating each other with respect. And so there's regardless of your job, your profession, there's something for you to do. And one of the most important things is making sure that you're taking care of yourself, because this is really hard work. And I know those of you who probably do this hear this a lot, but making sure, sometimes getting out of bed and putting on pants and eating cereal is activism, because that's what you need for you. And so not to lose sight of that, because, like I said at the very beginning, it's a privilege for me to be able to share my story. I'm not living in direct fear of my perpetrator right now, where so many other people are. And so to think about, there's different ways to be an activist, and nobody should have to share their story publicly. Nobody should have to stand on an Oscar stage or this stage to be believed and supported.
And I do want us to point out, too, that it's not up to survivors to end rape culture, just like it's not up to queer people to end homophobia or people of color to end racism. It's important for all of us to be part of the conversation. And no, it's not an easy conversation. Believe me, I've been in those situations where family members have said things that are really inappropriate, and I have felt unsafe. But it's so important that if you do feel safe in a situation, if you encounter something that that is just not okay, especially those everyday conversations, especially around sports, around media, that if you feel safe doing so, like, it's important to have these conversations. It shouldn't be up to us to wait for another Brock Turner case to actually have this conversation. You know, I think now this has become a conversation in the presidential election. Unfortunately, it's not become a very productive conversation as we wish that it would, but it's just so important for us to talk about the daily things that support a culture of violence and how it is that we can start having those everyday conversations to make sure that we create a culture that believes survivors rather than blame them for what happened to them.
Yeah, so these are the 3 most easy things that you can say that we always like to close with. So to any survivor in this room, because statistically we cannot be the only 2, I believe you, it's not your fault, and you're not alone. And if you know somebody and somebody discloses to you, those 3 things, saying that, and then also offering them choices and remembering that it's their decision to make in terms of how they want to proceed, if at all. And the fact that they shared something with you means they trust you. And so instead of questioning, just belief. Unfortunately, that's a radical act of everyday activism because we live in a society that tells us to do exactly the opposite. So, thank you. Thank you all again so much for being here. If you have to run to class, please go. And again, apologize for my feeling a little under the weather. Thank you for bearing with me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paige Davies, and I am the Safe at Weber Survivor Advocate here at Weber State. I know some of you might be running to class, but I have a few more announcements, and then we're going to do some open Q&A time with our speakers, if you can stick around. For those of you that do have to leave soon, though, I want to remind you, if you're interested in getting involved with Safe at Weber, you can go and see one of our staff members outside at the tables. They'll have the purple shirts on, and they have information about how you can sign up, get involved, and really help us prevent violence from happening in our communities and doing the things that our speakers talked about today, like helping us create that culture of accountability, believing survivors, and engaging in everyday activism. If you would like to report to the institution, we always like to make sure that you know how to do that. On the table outside and on your chairs, you have the rights and options brochures about where you can go for confidential support at the institution and in the community, as well as reporting to our Title IX coordinator, our law enforcement, or seeking advocacy services at the Women's Center. We also have the assessments, again, on your chairs. I realize that maybe not all of your pens may work, so if you can try to find one on the chairs around you that does, some of the ink is dried out. But if you can fill out the assessments, leave them on your chairs, and there's a basket in the back where you can drop them off. Either works perfectly. And please be sure to check out the resources outside, including we have free buttons and then a t-shirt donation table set up. Our event tonight starts at 7 p.m. in the ballroom next door, and they're going to be speaking again, sharing some more parts of their stories. So we hope to see you again tonight. It's free. Please invite all of your friends, family members, whoever to come with you. We'll also have copies of their book for sale outside, the We Believe You book, and I believe they'll be available to sign it as well. Sure, yes, I wanted to check. Please feel free if you have any questions to come up and use this mic here. Andy, can you check if it's turned on? Honorary.
I love my cat, Jorge.
Okay. So it's turned on, so please feel free to come up and ask any questions. I'm going to switch the presentation to some of our confidential and non-confidential resources on campus.
And if you don't want to ask a question publicly, we can just hang out here too, and we're available to talk one-on-one. I didn't need to do it.
Hi, my name is Trevor Johnson. I work at a nonprofit in Kaysville, Utah, servicing victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And my question was, this is pretty simple. what universities in the United States do you feel like are doing a great job of providing services to survivors, and what kinds of things are they doing? What does it look like?
First of all, thank you so much for your work. Really appreciate it, and we need more community partners for sure. I don't think there's one university that's doing everything right. There are some universities that have great dean of students offices, but then the police aren't that educated, and vice versa. And so what we've seen universities do well is when resources are streamlined and they're not siloed, and based on your identity, you don't have to go to 5 different places to receive help. Some universities have partnered with a local rape crisis center to have resources and training available to them. Having a confidential advisor is hugely important in what we find. It increases reporting. And so there's one program out in Oregon that the police have actually done called the You Have Options program, and have said, if you want to report, here we're going to give you all of your options, and we're going to work with you. And that initial conversation, having that person be trauma informed, is really important. And they've also seen reports going up and more people willing to be cooperative through the criminal adjudication system, criminal justice system. I'm trying to think what else.
Okay, so we had a program at Rutgers, New Brunswick, that had over 2,000 students come. That's probably the largest program we've ever gone to, and they have a really cool programming model because they program all year round. And like I said, we haven't really been in many universities where they do constant sexual assault and prevention programming. They do have a lot of funding. A lot of it is because the way it's kind of gone top to bottom, whereas the vice chancellor is very involved in programming. She attends most of the events, and she does require a lot of the other departments to be involved. So at this program in particular, they told us that they wanted to treat us like they treated Amy Schumer, which is really funny. But they basically, they generated a lot of interest, and they got every single department talking about it. So a lot of students that went to us said that, oh, we heard it from RA, we heard it from our professor, we heard it from dining staff. So it became this big community conversation. And unfortunately, that's just not the case for a lot of sexual assault programming. So I do think they have a really great model in being able to get the entire university, which, by the way, has over 60,000 students. So getting, that whole community involved, I think, is pretty exceptional.
And then also for faculty, having faculty be trained. And also some universities require that on the end of their syllabi that there are resources and Title IX information listed, and academic support listed as well. So thinking about, it's not just this one group that the Women's Center does, or the Title IX office, but it really permeates the culture of the institutions that do it well.
We should talk after.
We should, yeah.
Okay, so we did have to leave that for tonight's presentation because, it's hard to have it in all with just one presentation, but we do have a good chunk of just specifically media framing on sexual assault. So that is my personal research interest, right? Which a lot of faculty were just like, this is not a real field, but there's a lot to work on here. So I think one of my arguments in my first paper was specifically the way sexual assault is talked about. So I obviously focused on campus sexual assault, but I do think what's really interesting is that the media, which they'll always say that, oh no, it's not our fault, it's their fault, and that we're just reporting the news. But I do think the way that media talk about sexual violence contributes to the way people take it in. So specifically with this presidential candidate, they're really great about isolating him as just like this particular example, like this isn't a bigger conversation around the way people treat women. It's just him, it's just him, and it doesn't actually diminish from his ability to be a leader. So Annie and I go to the gym, and we get to watch media there. And there was one particular person who was one of his campaign managers who said that he's asked, I think he's an evangelical leader, but he said he's asked for forgiveness. And he's like, oh, he's asked for forgiveness, like we need to make sure that we forgive him. What's interesting is in that same segment, they talked about the Central Park Five, where that same leader defended I'm just going to say his name. So Trump's, basically what they've then called a public lynching of the Central Park Five. In that same segment, he said, well, we have to make sure that we don't completely forgive their actions for coming forward and admitting that they did it. But mind you, then later in the segment, he said, we have to make sure that we forgive him. He's then grown up as a politician. And also he says, his background's actually in reality TV, so how can we possibly blame him for not conducting himself that way? What's interesting is, again, this person is running to become president of the United States. So I do think a lot of it has to do with, people do give excuses to people that will protect really the society that they currently live in, because admitting that he's a reflection of our society is much too scary. Very much like admitting that Brock Turner, we all know a Brock Turner, is much too scary, because it means that we have a collective responsibility in addressing sexual violence.
And if we can isolate to one problem, one individual who committed something bad, then we don't have to look at it as a culture. And I think the media is really guilty and doing that and making these cases look like singular instances as opposed to a culture of violence that's normalized by things like what Trump said. And I also think it was interesting that not interesting is the wrong word, but truthful, that he goes, oh, that was just locker room banter, as if said in a locker room, that would be acceptable behavior. And so it was interesting the way a lot of people reported on that, saying, oh yeah, that's fine, he didn't know he was mic'd. You shouldn't be saying that anyway. And so that's that call out or call in culture and accountability that we need to have. And there's actually an article a coach wrote, and coaches have huge amounts of influence over their athletes, and particularly young men and boys, and how coaches are talking. Are they saying things like, you need to respect women, this is not locker room talk, not in my locker room? Or are they saying things like, you're running like a girl, or don't act gay? And so having coaches in leadership reflect the standards that we want in our society, rather than this locker room banter, I think that needs to happen as well.
And I do also say too, we've been talking about this too, it's not just the media, but also Hollywood. So in our brief experience with the industry, this is something that is just not a conversation in Hollywood. And it's this constant wanting to portray rape as a plot point. I mean, literally every single show, every single movie has at some point, these big movies, they reference rape as it's just one big plot point. So there's a movie now, we'll talk about it tonight, Birth of a Nation, which the director and lead star has gotten a lot of criticism from feminists, particularly because of allegations of sexual assault when he was a student athlete. But not removing that whole experience and not just focusing on the fact that he himself has been accused of sexual assault, but in the movie itself, a major plot point is the rape of his partner, which, by the way, did not historically happen, but he felt the need to put a graphic gang rape in the movie to define his reason for starting a slave rebellion. Like, he just created it. And actually, none of the female characters have major talking points. A lot of them are either responding to sexual violence or encouraging the male leads to continue doing what they're doing. So again, it's just become this plot point, not just in movies, but in society, right? And what's really unfortunate in particular with our work is that we're told, oh, look, because of what happened to you, look at all the great things you've done. And it's like, I really would have liked to have avoided this thing happening to me. I was pretty great before this happened to me. And it's not like rape is just something that's unavoidable. And unfortunately, I do think that in particular with the way the campaigns have been talking about it, not to mention it's gotten really out of hand and they're focusing on just these specific instances, we don't talk about this bigger problem of sexual violence and just how embedded it is in our society. And I do think, again, we have to become much more educated consumers in the way we criticize media, not just around the campaign, but in general the way they talk about sexual violence. Anyway.
So Payson High School had an assembly where it's strictly about like girls dressing modestly and basically kind of what you guys already had touched on. But as an aunt and having cousins who attend that, and where it's like, oh, boys only have to attend it after school, so they're not being pulled away from their education. It's just the girls. How do we implement something in our community and having that conversation with those girls, and as parents and cousins and aunts, like how do we tell them that school officials are telling them this, but then they're home with us? Like, how do we balance that out to where it's like, well, they're completely wrong, they shouldn't be teaching you that, but still having that safe environment where they feel like they can go and get an education?
Thank you for sharing that. And that's a really great example of just everyday sexism in our society. Do you want to? What? I am an aunt. Speaking to, my niece and my nephew about consent, about actually my niece, this boy was like chasing her around the playground and trying to like kiss her or whatever, and we had to have a conversation about that, saying like, that's not okay, this is your body, you can tell him no. And the feedback she was getting at school was like, oh, it's just cute, he likes you. And to really say no and call them in. And if I was a parent at that school, I would have a conversation with the administration, maybe with a group of parents, so it's not you're feeling like you're isolating one kid. But yeah, I think that's something that we see all across the country, is that girls will get that message. We were testifying in Virginia, I think, and you had girls given rape whistles and had a conversation, and the boys were told to go play basketball. And not only is that like completely erasing the fact that there are male survivors, but I mean, and just the victim blaming, I don't know, I would definitely have a conversation with them. But also, I think there are ways to have talks about things like dressing, like how you want to dress, and being respected about it. And you can still have that conversation, but it doesn't have to be in a victim-blaming way. Just like we can have a conversation about responsible drinking and being a responsible adult, but it doesn't have to be victim-blaming either. The lens can change.
Yeah, so I mean, we have heard of pretty terrible examples where people have actually used the hunting ground to just show it to their female seniors and have handed out flyers telling them what to do to avoid getting raped. So we've heard of these things happen. We obviously don't endorse these programs. But, you know, unfortunately, again, like even with the hunting ground, despite the fact that a lot of the framing of the hunting ground is around this bigger cultural and institutional problem, you know, people are still much more inclined to think, you know, what can we do to protect our girls, or how can we help our girls become much more educated? And this is this bigger problem of media framing and this bigger problem of the way we talk about sexual violence. We talk about it as being something that's avoidable, and that's really because sexual assault, like a lot of crimes, is framed episodically. So I think it just happens, you know, the way media cover it, it's just this one sexual assault, not this bigger problem. And actually there really weren't any not much coverage about campus sexual assault up until 2013. And that's because up until then, reporters weren't even covering sexual assault as being really a national problem. They were covering it as individual cases at individual schools. And what that leads to is, well, not on my campus, or I would have done something differently, or clearly she made a mistake, you know, because again, framing things episodically removes our cultural and individual responsibility for this bigger problem of rape culture, because thinking that we have anything to do with these bigger problems or the way that these boys are being raised makes us uncomfortable. Because again, it's not our responsibility, it's not our household, but again, we do all have this collective responsibility to have these conversations, because we're really all at fault for rape culture, even if not with individual actions, with just being passive when these conversations are being had or when these things are not being talked about.
And I think, is it Trevor, is that your name who spoke? Yeah, to address one of the best practices and sort of bring these two conversations together. In our presentation, we were talking about the Clery Act, and when those messages, those timely alerts go out, I always like to see what's at the bottom of them. So a lot of schools, we were just at one school in Texas, and it had safety tips of don't wear headphones, make sure your phone is always charged, don't walk alone. And that was their this person was assaulted, so in order to not be assaulted, do this. And actually at the University of Oregon, there is a clearly like timely warning best practice thing that shows like what is the best language to make sure that survivors are feeling supported and know what their resources are and coming forward, and they've actually seen reports increase. So I'm bringing that together because thinking about all the ways you are, as you know, a teacher or an administrator, indirectly sometimes either being victim blaming or not being supportive, and you might not mean to intentionally, right? But all those words are really important, and thinking about all the different ways students, whether they be in middle school, high school, or higher ed, are getting these messages. And so I think, yeah, to definitely talk to your niece and her friends, and yeah.
I work with the VA on campus. I'm a veteran too. How do you guys work with military at all, or have them come to you?
Yeah, so actually our film director and producer, their film prior to this was the film called The Invisible War, which was about sexual assault in the military. And actually they decided to make this one after going around to so many students, screening The Invisible War and having students say the institutional betrayal that exists in the military exists on my campus. So yeah, we do some work with MST survivors, and did we do SHARP? No, we were going to. We didn't.
We almost did a SHARP program,
Yeah.
but it was like right after we came out from an international flight. But yeah, we do work with.
I was just wondering because I'm trying to reach out because I have a couple MST clients, and I'm one as well. So I'm trying to find ways to work with campus and everything, resources. So any idea what to help? Because I know that's where I'm going to do after.
So actually, one of the interesting things I discovered when I was trained to be an RA is that we actually don't even talk about veteran students at all in our training. Like, despite the fact that we did have first-year veteran students that were living in residence halls. And that's actually even a bigger conversation. Like, are people even talking about veterans? Like, RAs talking about them? Like, are we having conversations about how to even support veterans? Not even if they have MST, but just in general. I mean, like, relocating back to civilian life, what does that mean? Like, is that even a conversation? Because I don't even know how it is here, but I can tell you at my school, it was not a conversation. So like when you had this added layer of MST, you know, even if you have really great staff that know how to deal with sexual assault, they might not necessarily know how to deal with these bigger added layers of institutional betrayal after experiencing MST in the military, or having to deal with if there's still this constant fear. So actually I had a resident who was being stalked and harassed by an active duty military member. And I remember that was a big conversation because she was a civilian and no one knew what to do. Like, how do we get him to stop harassing her because he's not a student? So we actually had this really great police officer who ended up calling his commanding officer and reported it. So had I not found that individual police officer, which by the way, this is not protocol for my job, I had to figure out how to do it. Like, had I not found that police officer, I would have never known how to get this person help because it just wasn't a conversation. We had, even though the person was active duty within North Carolina, there was no conversation about how to talk within military circles. So I do think that's just one conversation. Like, are we even talking about, you know, transitioning students? Two, like, how do we make sure that folks that support survivors know about the added layers of trauma with MST? Y'all should talk.
So my name is Maddie Barney. I filed the Title IX complaint at BYU earlier in the year. But my question is, how do you know that they're actually changing? Like, how do you think that Title IX is effective in the action? Because they haven't ever pulled funding. There's been like multiple Title IX complaints at some schools. Like, how do you know that it's being effective? And if it's not, what do we need to do to make it effective?
That's a really good question, and thank you both for sharing. And yeah, it's not, and this is a personal opinion, it's not the most effective, it's not as effective as I wish it was. And the same thing with filing complaints. What we found was it wasn't the complaint itself, it was the media attention surrounding the complaint that sort of put the school under a microscope that forced them then to change. And we have seen definite improvement on some campuses in very real and concrete ways, but also, like Andrea said, institutional memory is very short. And so making sure that, you know, first-year students are hearing this and are mentoring, you know, younger students. And I think what has to happen in concrete ways, one, are our state laws. A lot of them are very antiquated and archaic and don't encompass all survivors' experiences, at least not for like rape 1. So we've had male survivors or even people who identify as women who have been anally raped, and in their states they've been told it doesn't count, we could do simple assault, but because it's only penal vaginal in some states, that their experiences have been literally dismissed as not actual sexual violence. So I think, you know, one, we need to change our state laws and state statutes. California just eliminated their statute of limitations for rape, which is also really important for children survivors. So I think on the concrete state level, we have a lot of work. We have a bill right now federally called the Campus Accountability and Safety Act, which is bipartisan. I don't think it's going to get through before next Congress. I don't think much of anything's getting through before next Congress. But it's one of the few bipartisan bills where you have Marco Rubio standing next to Barbara Boxer. And so they're listening, and there have been changes. The Department of Education has, you know, done things like release the names. They've released more guidance at the pressure because of pressure from students. But, you know, culture change takes a really long time, and I think sometimes it's really easy to get jaded and frustrating just because it is so glacial. But I'm seeing a national conversation, and Andrea has data to back it up, that shows that the way we're talking about this is shifting. And I also think, you know, it's never really done. Like, once you get to the commitment part of the House, like, you can still go higher. It's an ever-growing process. And I think something that I've seen come out of this sort of movement is that there's a lot of survivor solidarity, and a lot of people who didn't have a place before don't feel as alone. We have a national parents group now where parents are connecting with other parents for support, which is really cool. And just in general, I mean, if you are seeing anything on Twitter or social media, like, people are speaking up. And I know it goes in waves, and there was like a spike in the 90s too, but I think the very fact that we're having this conversation means things are moving hopefully in the right direction. And even though it is sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I'd like to say I think I'm seeing improvement.
But I will validate your frustrations that it's not happening fast enough and that it's oftentimes not the way you want it to look like. I mean, for example, the School of Journalism right now is supporting a campaign run by, the School of Journalism at UNC is supporting a campaign run by journalism students to require university to finally grant their FOIA request, or their Freedom of Information Act request, to grant them the data of how many students have been punished by the university adjudication system. So there's currently anecdotal evidence that UNC has not expelled anyone for sexual assault for over 25 years. We do not know if that's actually being backed by university sanctioned data, and the university continues to hide behind FERPA and say that they cannot release this aggregate data. But again, I do think that although things aren't the way I want them to be at UNC, and it's been quite some time since we filed our complaint, what gets me, what kind of gets me up every morning and what gives me hope is that there are students who are still fighting every single day for it. And I think a lot of it has to do with mentorship within the movement. And that's something that I'm really passionate about, is that if anyone reaches out to me and wants ideas or wants support in kind of navigating a movement on their campus, is to be that resource. Because when I first came forward, it was really hard to find someone to talk to. Like, I found all these journal articles and I found, these old newspaper clippings, but it was really hard to find anybody who knew what I was going through, because it just simply wasn't a conversation. Now it's a little different. Now you can, very much like that little graphic that we had of reaching out across the country, like, there are survivors all around the country who are coming forward every single day to make sure this is going to get better. It's not going to get better overnight, but I do think that the constant pressure is going to make things change. I think a good example is what's happening at Baylor. I mean, like, I remember someone asked me a year ago if Art Briles was going to get fired. I'm like, no. And then, Art Briles got fired. Not to mention, not only did Art Briles get fired, but pretty much every single major, figure in that case is no longer part of that university. And that was a huge deal. I don't think things are 100% better at Baylor, but I do think that they're not getting away from the pressure. I mean, the pressure is still, ever increasing at Baylor. And I do think that, again, this kind of larger accountability is really what's going to make this thing better. I don't think it's on survivors' backs. This is going to get better. I think it's on every single person being involved, and that starts with alumni making calls. Like I've asked all of my friends at UNC. We now have a really public case now against a football player. Make calls to the university council, if someone sends you, like they sent Annie mail for donation, make sure that you write, I'm not donating until you change this problem, because again, like they might not listen to one survivor, but they're going to listen to thousands of alumni who are no longer going to be part of that community and no longer be considered members of this institution until they change something.
So I just came here for the Q&A, so I missed your presentation. I'm scared of asking a question because I don't want to appear ignorant, but what I have wondered with sexual assault is I saw a blog one time about naming your rapist, and so I'm wondering how effective that would be how effective do you think that is in changing the culture and creating the conversation? What repercussions are there to naming your rapist?
Yeah, so one, I don't think it's an ignorant question. I think it's actually a very good question. So unfortunately, we live in a very litigious society, specifically in the States, where if you name your perpetrator and that person has not been criminally convicted of rape specifically, you likely are exposed to a defamation lawsuit. So pretty much every survivor who has named their perpetrator and that person has not gotten a conviction has likely at some point either been threatened with a defamation lawsuit or has had to face that. So Erica Kinsman, for example, who's a survivor at FSU, is currently still dealing with a defamation lawsuit filed by Jameis Winston. What's interesting about Jameis Winston is that there's this legal argument that he's a public figure. So, I mean, there are legal scholars who I'm sure can answer this question better. But if the person's a public figure, then your defamation lawsuits are a little less likely to be successful because it's very hard for a celebrity to prove that that they have extenuating damage because of these allegations. But unfortunately, there is this risk of being sued for defamation. We've worked with a lot of survivors who've been sued by a perpetrator. Even if they don't name them, even if they tell a friend that they were assaulted by someone, these people have filed lawsuits, unfortunately.
And I think, if that's an option for somebody, if they want to, I think, either sharing your story publicly, naming your perpetrator, obviously you've got to be concerned about the defamation stuff, but that's a really individual choice. And I think for some people it might be empowering, and for other people they just don't want to deal with it. And then other people can't because of reasons of safety, very similar to sharing, stories. And I think, because so many people have started to come out, there's this pressure to share your story. But I really don't think that should exist. And if that's something that somebody wants to do publicly or privately, great, but nobody should ever feel like they have to share in the media in order to get the support they deserve.
And I think also it's so important to go back to this conversation of fixing our criminal justice system, because even if somebody spends a day in jail, the likelihood that they will plea it down to a misdemeanor means that they'll no longer be considered a rapist, I think is a very important conversation. Actually, a lot of these cases, like the case at St. Paul's in New Hampshire, he ended up pleading to sexual misconduct, I think, or cyber misconduct. So he's not going to be listed as a rapist, right? So, I mean, if somebody calls him a rapist, he technically can sue them for defamation. So I do think it talks about these bigger barriers that survivors have to deal with, because you literally can't even share your truth without becoming bankrupt because somebody's suing you. And unfortunately, that is a reality. We've had to talk to clients and saying, like, it's up to you. You can say whatever you want to say, but just know that, like, you might have to deal with this added risk. And unfortunately, a lot of lawyers out there don't want to take these cases because, they're very controversial, or the survivor might not have the money to pay them up front. So, again, there's these larger barriers that are keeping survivors silent, and they're unable to share their whole truth. So unfortunately, although again, it's up to every survivor to seek whatever type of justice or self-care they want, there's this fear of being sued for sharing your truth. Oh, elbow bump, okay.